We know a good deal about how physiology can affect food choice, but what about psychological aspects?
Well, I think it's actually quite difficult to separate psychology and biology when it comes to eating. How we think about food and how we think about our appetite affects our experience of eating. Pleasure is really fundamental to eating. It's the anticipation of the pleasure of eating is what motivates us to prepare a meal or order a meal in a restaurant or go to and get a takeaway meal from our local shop. And the pleasure of consuming that food is what keeps us consuming it. It rewards our eating. So it's fundamentally part of the eating experience. Some people have argued that there's a homeostatic component of our eating and there's a pleasure component. The idea is that eating really is about getting enough fuel, enough nutrients to fuel our bodily functions. That's the homeostatic part. But we're tempted to eat more than that by the hedonic aspects of eating. I don't really buy that idea for a number of reasons. I don't think that is the experience we have of eating. All eating is pleasurable. So we often have this idea that food tastes less good when we're full or better when we're hungry. What we found is actually the taste of food, how pleasant it tastes in the mouth, doesn't change much with eating. It's actually the pleasantness of eating, that is, tasting the food and ingesting it. And when we're full, it's the pleasantness of eating, the pleasantness of ingesting the food that goes down.
So is that potentially one thing that could underlie overeating, that we eat even though we're full, even though we're satiated? Because of the pleasure we're getting from taste, we just keep eating?
Well, yes, that would certainly be the case. By choosing very highly pleasurable foods that we really like, then we can overcome, to an extent, the lack of pleasure we get from the meal because we're full. But I think it's interesting, fascinating, that actually we recover from that state quite quickly. Just after a few hours, we're ready to eat again. And I think that reflects our biology, that actually we should be ready to eat. Again, it's not about balancing the energy that we've just used very recently, but it's about hedging against the possible availability of food in the future. I could give you an example of cognitive influences on eating and the experience of eating. There's a very nice study by Rick Mattis and his colleagues from Purdue University in the USA. What they did was, or part of what they did, was to show participants a novel drink they said they were developing. And on one occasion, the participants were told, when you consume this drink, it has a special gelling substance in it that we're designing to help people make people feel a bit fuller. And they demonstrated what would happen when it goes into the stomach, and they poured this drink into a beaker. And in the beaker was a chemical substance, so that when this drink was poured in, it appeared to gel. It became quite viscous. They also demonstrated what would happen to the drink without this special substance in, and that just remained liquid in the beaker. So when the participants actually consume these drinks, actually neither of them contained the gel. But if the participants believed they consumed the gel-containing drink, they reported feeling much fuller. What's even perhaps more surprising is that those who thought it was a gel went on to eat less food later on at a meal. But also this affected how fast their stomach emptied as well, whether or not they believed the drink had this gel in it, and even had some small but reliable effects on gut hormone signals.
So what do we know about the effect of attentiveness on eating and food choice?
Well, we do know attention to eating is important. So one of the basic demonstrations here is if someone is distracted when they're eating, that they will eat more. Not only during the meal when they're distracted, but also, interestingly, later on at the next meal. And the idea behind that is that our memory for what we've eaten recently has a big influence on our current food choices. So we fed people soup at lunch, but this was a clever soup bowl where we had a tube stuck in the bottom of the soup bowl, which the participants weren't aware about. And we could pump in extra soup or take out some soup from that bowl while they were eating. But effectively what we could do was manipulate what people saw they'd eaten, how much they saw had been removed from the bowl, and separate that out from how much they actually ate. And the results showed that a person's fullness after the meal was strongly influenced by how much they saw they'd eaten, especially actually from about 2 hours after eating. So our interpretation of that is what you're left with is the memory of how much you've eaten, which was based on how much they perceived they'd eaten. And that memory will be very important in making decisions about our next food choices. In order to form a good memory of what we've eaten, we must be attentive when we're consuming a particular meal, and distraction will disrupt that process. And in these studies, the suggestion would cause us to overeat. What happens if you can't form memories of what you've eaten? So there's been a few, I think, very informative studies on amnesic patients, so patients who can't form good short-term memories. And if they eat a meal, they then forget about that meal they've eaten. They have no recollection of that. If they're then offered a further meal, they will go ahead and eat that meal in its entirety. And in these studies, some patients have been fed up to 3 reasonably sized meals and show no sign of actually stopping eating. For ethical reasons, the researchers stopped at that point. But what's really informative about these studies is that these individuals actually did complain of feeling uncomfortable and so on, but didn't describe their experience as fullness, of having their appetite sated. So without being able to remember having eaten and associate that with their physical sensations, they couldn't report fullness. And the pleasure of eating is that often I think we interpret that as being indulgent in relation to food. Actually, food is about fuel and healthiness and so on, and pleasure has no place in that. That's not a helpful idea, nor do I think it matches our biology. Actually, in terms of overeating, yes, pleasure is important, that our food technology has made foods that are really very attractive. In a way, that's a good thing. We can enjoy those foods. But perhaps that does tempt us to eat more calories than we need. At the same time, it's perhaps not just about the pleasure, but it's the accessibility. But if I can just reach out and get it, then I will, and I will eat it. So I can almost overcome that lack of motivation to eat because food is so readily available. And to some extent, I think that is one of the big things that encourages overconsumption.
Once, Sue, at the end of a lecture, he was kind of sitting and having a think, and he said, "What would happen if you took 2 muffins? One was a kind of muffin shape, and the other one was shaped like a." And I had a feeling where he was going. I didn't have an answer for that. But
there's actually some great research by Paul Rosin that does that. So he has a plastic dog turd that he puts next to food, and it becomes contaminated. Yeah. He puts food in a jar that's labelled poison, and again, people become wary of that, even though they're told that look, this is a jar. There's never been poison in this jar. I promise you. Here's the label. I'm seeing it's a perfect.
And it's powerful.
Yeah, it's very powerful.